Hello everyone. Today we are going to do a brief overview of fairy tales in literature. First, let's talk about the pre-literary period. That means before fairy tales were ever written down. So we know that fairy tales are really old world folk tales. Folklore is the genre. They originated in the oral tradition. The term fairy tale doesn't really quite cover it because not all of the stories have fairies in them. One of the terms that has been bounced around as of late is called wonder tale. So it could be called a fairy tale or a wonder tale, which really makes sense considering the tales and the stories. Now, the stories were often told by women. Now, think about hundreds of years ago, a woman having the job of having to spin the cloth, and she sits at a spinning wheel and she spins and weaves the cloth, and maybe many women get together in the community or the village and do this together, and as they're spinning the cloth they are also spinning tales. They're telling stories because after all, spinning cloth has to be pretty boring. So therefore, this whole idea of storytelling and spinning tales is something that kept them entertained. So it's believed that women were primarily the ones who told the stories and brought that cultural history to their community and continued to pass down these stories from generation to generation. Here's another interesting little thing is that it's possible that the word spinster came from the women who would sit and spin who never married. So a spinster is a woman who never marries. She sits and she spins tales as she is spinning the thread to make the cloth. Now, fairy tales are worldwide. They come from every culture in the world. There's Asian and African, Australian, European, North American, South American. They come from all over the world. But we have a bit of a Eurocentric and Disney-centric view of fairy tales. It's the lens we see them through in most cases. But many of these tales, it's really interesting because many of the tales, very similar tales, are told throughout the world, very similar stories. So, for example, Cinderella, the storyline of Cinderella is told in almost every single culture, has some differences. In one culture, Cinderella may, have a glass slipper. In another culture, it might be a wooden shoe. So can be quite different from culture to culture. And this was during a time, if you think about it, this was during a time when people really didn't have the ability to travel, and they certainly didn't have the internet. So communication across the world just wasn't something that went on. So for these tales to have gotten spread, and in many cases we don't know for sure where they originally came from or where they may have originated from, but it's really kind of fascinating to think that the same stories seem to have originated out of many different cultures. It is believed, at least I've read in the past, that Cinderella was possibly originated in China, yet there is a tale in every country that is very similar and just as old as far as we can tell. Now, what are fairy tales? Marina Warner, who is one of the experts in fairy tales, she calls it shape-shifting. Basically, fairy tales are told and retold, and every time they're told and retold, they're reimagined, they're repurposed, and they're shaped and reshaped again and again and again. And it depends on the culture and the folklore and the customs and social and historical conditions as to what happens with the tale. So if you've ever played telephone where the first person starts and then they whisper to the next person, and then that person whispers the same message to the next person, and all the way down the line, and then at the end of the line, the last person tells you, what was the first thing said, and it turns out to be something different. Well, that's what happens with these oral stories where the storyteller, also changes them up for their audience and to match up with, what's going on in their world at that time. There are many different characteristics of fairy tales, ones that you should be quite familiar with. So once upon a time, in a kingdom far, far away, imaginary time and place. We don't really have a specific time in history or a specific place for any of the tales. They just seem to happen in this kingdom or somewhere far away. There's often royalty and poverty, which obviously makes sense since most of the world lived in monarchy type countries or kingdoms. And, there were those who were the royals and the aristocrats, and then there was everybody else, the peasants, and that lived in poverty, while the royals and the aristocrats lived with wealth and riches. And so you can imagine that many of these stories evolve around that and why. And of course, fairy tales have magic and enchantments and wonders. And then there's recurring patterns. So when you are reading fairy tales and you're writing your reflections journals, one of the things you want to do is start paying attention to these things. What do you notice, and what do you notice across different fairy tales, and what kind of patterns do you see? Like 3s and 6s and 7s are often said again and again. Or there's certain creatures that pop up again and again, like frogs or shoes tend to show up in many different fairy tales, or mirrors. Mirrors show up a lot. So these are things that, are recurring in various fairy tales. And then we have fantastical elements, just, things that just simply could not happen, like spinning straw into gold. So those are fantastical elements. And of course, there's good versus evil. And generally, they are in the form of characters. We have our good characters, our hero, our heroine. Then we have our evil, maniacal, menacing characters like the witch in several fairy tales. Now, heroes, one of the experts in fairy tales, Angela Carter, she calls this heroic optimism, because one of the shining qualities of fairy tales is they often give us hope, but not always. They don't always have a happy ending. For example, in one version of Little Red Riding Hood, the wolf eats Grandma and Little Red, and that's it, the end. There's nothing optimistic about that, and no hero to come save the day. But in another version, a woodsman shows up and saves the day. In a different version, the father of Little Red Riding Hood shows up and saves the day. So there are many different versions, and usually there's a hero in just about every fairy tale, but that's not always 100% the case. Now, fairy tales do tend to have their own narrative structure. They tend to start with an introduction to the characters, and then a moral supposition with basically an assumption that we are all going to, agree with this moral, especially as later on you'll learn when we look at the history of fairy tales, when they started to get written down, one of the characteristics of those who wrote them down, such as Perrault and the Grimm's brothers, is that they thought of them as moral tales for children, and that's really kind of how we see them today, even though the original tales really weren't for children. Another thing we need to keep in mind in that particular vein is that what they considered for children 100 years ago or 200 years ago versus what we would consider appropriate for children today is quite different. And you'll kind of see that even as you get into reading some of these tales that are not the Disney version. So we have our moral supposition, and then the events. Usually they tend to come in threes. There's that number, there's that pattern again. And in fact, in lots of stories, the number 3 is, 3 events is pretty common. So I think we get that from fairy tales. And then, of course, there's bad loses, good wins. Generally a moral conclusion and often a happily ever after. So fairy tales provided a kind of hope. And then, of course, there were universal truths and themes. So things like, love and perseverance, or whatever the truth or universal theme might be in the different fairy tales, but those are pretty common as well. Now, there's some common motifs or distinctive features and dominant ideas that we see throughout fairy tales. For example, our talking animals, and then we have trickster tales where, the character plays tricks, or word games like in Rumpelstiltskin, traveler's tales, and then often tales are told to kind of try to help people. They would tell them to try to kind of figure out and understand, their world and their universe and even where they came from. Then, of course, human weaknesses and strengths have always been a part of story, and tall stories have a tendency to have creep their way into fairy tales as well, with some hyperbole, slight exaggeration. Then we see some magic words and phrases, abracadabra. Guardians, there's often guardians in fairy tales, like the fairy godmother in Cinderella, or there might be a mentor or guide. And then there's monsters, the evil creatures, and the dragons, and the ogres, and the trolls. Of course, as we already said, good versus evil, light versus dark. That seems to be a pretty strong theme running through just about every fairy tale out there. Sometimes we have youngest versus oldest, the whole sibling rivalry thing. Sleep, extended sleep in trances, as in Sleeping Beauty. Impossible task, trying to spin that straw into gold, going on to quest, or even gluttony or starvation. And then sometimes donors and benefactors and helpers come along in our fairy tales as well. So these are things that you're going to want to start noticing as you're reading the fairy tales, and these are opportunities to talk about them in your journal and in the forums, and to do some analysis work to kind of try to figure out what's really going on in these stories. Because even though they seem very simple, they really often have very complex and meanings, often both innocent and dark. And so there's a lot more to these tales than we could even begin to imagine. So, like, for example, Little Red Riding Hood, is it really just about a little girl who gets eaten by a wolf and gets saved by, the huntsman? Or is it really a story warning young girls and women about being wary of strange men who may not have their best interest in mind and may hurt them in some way? So these stories are, about life too. They're not just, silly little tales. There's a lot more to it. So when we interpret fairy tales, which is what you do when you do literary analysis, there's different ways that they have been interpreted by scholars, and I'm just going to go through a few of the little ways that happens. So let me see if I can pronounce this right. Jungian archetypes is one way of interpreting a fairy tale, where you're looking at man's collective subconscious, collective dreams, shared experiences, deepest desires and fears. There's a lot of fear in fairy tales. Little Red Riding Hood, she's warned by her mother, don't you dare go off the path. Don't talk to strangers. Don't do this. Don't do that. Especially in the tales that in later years, when they started to get written down, they were written down as moral tales and sort of meant to discipline through fear. What's an archetype? An archetype is a typical character, an action, or a situation that seems to represent universal patterns of human nature, also known as a universal symbol that may be a character, a theme, a symbol, or even setting. So these are things that you can look at when you're trying to interpret fairy tales. Another way to interpret fairy tales is through Freudian psychoanalysis, which can be kind of interesting. Psychoanalysis was founded by Sigmund Freud, and he believed that people could be cured by making conscious their unconscious thoughts and motivations, thus gaining insight. They can get better this way. They can feel better. They can release their repressed emotions and make the unconscious conscious. So he was very concerned with the identity, ego, superego, and how they're always at war, and how our primal needs are at odds with our consciences. And there's a lot of this thematically through a lot of fairy tales. And so you can spend some time looking at a fairy tale from this perspective and thinking about, getting into the psyche a little bit of the characters. Now, feminist theory is really big in fairy tales. And, what feminists do is they try to understand the nature of inequality, and they focus on gender politics and power relations and sexuality. And what's really interesting, I ran across an article recently about the Me Too movement and how some feminists are now saying that, Sleeping Beauty, it's bad for young girls and women to read and know this story because the prince never asked Sleeping Beauty for permission to kiss her. Now, some of us may think that's a little silly, but others think that's a very serious, topic to be explored within the fairy tales. So that's another perspective to look at it. They also looked at fertility, discrimination, stereotyping, objectification, especially sexual objectification, oppression, and patriarchy within these stories, and how that's evolved over time, and how society has reacted to women or treated women throughout history. Then, of course, there's historical analysis. So that's seeing it through a historical lens and seeing it as a way to preserve history and legend and customs. And, if you look at a tale and where it originated from what country, and, if you can find any history on the tale itself, you might be able to kind of get a sense of knowing the customs and the folklore and the kind of the rules of society of the time might help you to understand the tale a little bit better. And then, of course, a lot of fairy tales end with a moral lesson, especially Charles Perrault, which we'll learn more about when we look at the history of fairy tales. He was one of the first to start writing them down. He collected them, and he also wrote his own, and he ended them with a moral lesson. He saw them as something that could be a moral tale.